There was a time when everything felt simpler, or at least it looked that way on TV, before the internet rewrote our memories, before we realized the dream we were sold had fine print. This is Nostalgia Couch Potato, where we sit back, press play, and figure out what the 90s were actually trying to tell us. Let's get into it. There was a very specific kind of optimism in the late 80s and 90s, the kind where the biggest problem in your life was whether your crush liked you back and the world outside your neighborhood barely existed. And if you were a middle schooler flipping channels after school, few shows bottled that feeling better than Sweet Valley High. Before it was a glossy syndicated TV series with blowouts and blazers, it was a paperback empire. The Sweet Valley High novels were created by Francine Pascal in 1983, and if your mom worked at a library like mine did, those pastel spines were unavoidable. You'd see rows of them, identical twins, perfect hair, dramatic taglines. It was aspirational, but safe. California sunshine in mass market form. The premise was deceptively simple. Identical twins, Elizabeth and Jessica Wakefield, navigate life at Sweet Valley High, a fictional suburban paradise where the lawns were green, the boys were cute, and consequences rarely lingered longer than 150 pages. Elizabeth was the responsible one. Jessica was the wild card. Between them, they covered every middle school fantasy of who you might become. By the time the TV adaptation hit in 1994, it felt inevitable. Of course, Sweet Valley High would become a show. Of course, it would look like a Delia's catalog exploded onto a soundstage. Of course, it would air in that magical after-school block of syndicated programming that also gave us Breaker High, the semester at sea fever dream that somehow launched Ryan Gosling before most of us knew how to pronounce his name. But Sweet Valley High was different. It wasn't about escape. It was about reassurance. It told us high school would be dramatic, sure, but it would also be fun, manageable, sun-drenched. It promised that the good times wouldn't just come, they'd stay. And because this was pre-September 11th America, pre-constant news ticker, pre-social media self-surveillance, that promise felt believable. From paperback phenomenon to 90s time capsule. By the early 90s, the books had sold millions of copies. The franchise expanded into spin-offs, Sweet Valley Twins, Sweet Valley University, even darker senior year arcs. The brand wasn't just popular, it was industrial. It ran on a book packaging model with ghostwriters working under Pascal's supervision, a kind of literary assembly line that churned out teen drama with astonishing consistency. So when producers adapted it for TV, they leaned into the fantasy. The series starred real-life twins Brittany Daniel and Cynthia Daniel as Jessica and Elizabeth. They weren't just cast because they could act. They were the visual thesis statement of the franchise. Blonde, symmetrical, effortlessly Californian. The show ran from 1994 to 1997 in first-run syndication. It never dominated the ratings like primetime network hits, but it didn't need to. It lived in that 90s ecosystem where shows could survive off loyal after-school audiences and international sales. It thrived in the VHS era, in the space between homework and dinner. And yes, one of the twins, Brittany Daniel, would later pop up in the game, which for some of us was a weird, delightful wait I know you moment years later. But back then, they were just the Wakefields. Untouchable, eternal juniors in a world where prom was always coming and adulthood was theoretical. The illusion of high school we all bought. Here's the thing about Sweet Valley High. It quietly sold us a template. Gen Xers were already aging out when it hit TV, but younger Gen Xers and early Zennials absorbed it at just the right moment. It suggested high school would be a glossy mix of romance, rivalry, and pep rallies. Even the serious episodes, drinking, jealousy, betrayal, wrapped themselves up in a neat moral bow by the end. It was a safe rehearsal space for adolescence. And when we eventually got to high school, lockers dented, budgets cut, world events looming larger than any student council election, it didn't quite match the brochure. Columbine changed the tone of teen media. Then 9/11 changed the tone of everything. The hopeful insulation of early 90s teen TV began to feel like it belonged to a different country. Watching Sweet Valley High now feels like opening a time capsule from before the ambient anxiety kicked in, before we were told to be afraid all the time, before irony swallowed sincerity whole. It's goofy, it's melodramatic, it's aggressively wholesome, and that's exactly why it mattered. How it ended and why it had to. By 1997, the cultural winds were shifting. Teen TV was getting sharper, edgier. Shows like Beverly Hills 90210 had already proven that audiences wanted more serialized, emotionally complicated storytelling. Soon, the late 90s would usher in a new wave of teen drama that felt less pastel and more self-aware. Sweet Valley High wrapped after 4 seasons and 88 episodes. Not with scandal, not with collapse, just with the quiet reality that its moment had passed. The books continued in various forms, but the particular magic of that TV era belonged to a narrow cultural window, the mid-90s, when everything still felt like it was building towards something bright. Why it still hits? If you revisit it today, it's not just about the hair or the soundtrack or the aggressively symmetrical casting. It's about remembering who you were when you watched it. Maybe you were sitting in a living room after school. Maybe your mom had just brought home another paperback from the library. Maybe you really believed high school would look like Southern California, even if you lived in upstate New York. Sweet Valley High wasn't revolutionary television. It wasn't prestige drama. It didn't change the art form. But for a slice of Gen X and Zennials, it quietly defined what we thought the good years were going to look like. And for a while, just between 3:30 and 4 p.m. before the world got heavier, it felt like they might last forever. Before there were slow-motion hallway walks and pastel blazers on syndicated television, there was a machine. Not in a cynical way, okay, maybe a little cynical, but in that fascinating pre-algorithm way where publishing figured out how to industrialize teen feelings. At the center of it all was Francine Pascal, who didn't just write a teen series, she architected one. When the Sweet Valley High launched in 1983, it wasn't positioned as a prestige literary endeavor. It was positioned as addictive, affordable, collectible. The covers were instantly recognizable. Identical blonde twins, dramatic poses, and taglines that promised betrayal, romance, or scandal, sometimes all 3 in 200 pages. And here's the part that feels very behind the curtain. Pascal didn't write most of them. Sweet Valley High was produced through a book packaging system. Pascal created the universe, the characters, the tone, but a team of ghostwriters worked from detailed outlines to keep the series pumping out new titles at breakneck speed. At its height, there were multiple books published each year. It was basically the Marvel Cinematic Universe of teen paperback fiction, except instead of multiverses, you got prom queens and secret crushes. And honestly, it worked. By the early 90s, the franchise had sold millions of copies worldwide. There were spin-offs everywhere. Sweet Valley Twins for younger readers, Sweet Valley University for when you wanted to pretend adulthood would still be this emotionally manageable, even darker arcs later on, where the tone shifted and the drama got heavier, almost as if the audience was aging and the world was too. If you were a kid wandering library stacks in the late 80s or early 90s, those books were inevitable. They were aspirational but safe. California without smog, wealth without bills, drama without permanent damage. And they sold a very specific fantasy: the Wakefield Blueprint. Jessica and Elizabeth weren't just characters, they were a psychological Rorschach test for middle schoolers. Elizabeth was responsible, thoughtful, morally grounded. Jessica was impulsive, glamorous, and occasionally chaotic. Between them, the series quietly told readers you can be the good girl or the fun girl, the writer or the cheerleader, the heart or the heat. And because they were identical twins, the tension was visual and thematic. 2 paths, same face. For Gen X readers and early Zennials, this wasn't just entertainment, it was rehearsal.
The books offered scripts for jealousy, dating, friendship betrayal, popularity politics. They made high school feel like a contained ecosystem where everything mattered enormously, but nothing destroyed you permanently. It was suburban drama with a safety net. A perfect pre-internet storm. It's important to remember, this was pre-social media, pre-streaming, pre-everything on demand. You couldn't Google spoilers, you couldn't watch fan edits. You waited for the next book to hit the shelves. You maybe begged your parent to grab the newest one at the grocery store checkout line. The anticipation was part of the ritual. And because it was physical, those pastel covers lined up on your shelf, it felt like ownership, identity even. Liking Sweet Valley High meant something about you. It meant you bought into the dream. Why it was inevitable it became TV. By the time the mid-90s rolled around, adapting Sweet Valley High for television wasn't risky, it was logical. The brand recognition was already there, the audience had aged into prime teen TV viewership, the formula was proven. Romance, rivalry, moral lesson, reset. So when Sweet Valley High premiered in 1994, it wasn't launching from scratch. It was capitalizing on a decade of paperback conditioning. And maybe that's why it felt so seamless to us watching after school. It didn't feel like an adaptation. It felt like the books had simply stepped into color and motion. The publishing machine had done its job. It had trained us to believe in Sweet Valley long before we ever saw it.
Adapting Sweet Valley High for television came with one non-negotiable requirement. You had to believe the twins. Not TV twins, not we'll fix it with camera angles twins. Real twins. Enter Brittany Daniel and Cynthia Daniel, identical, blonde, California-raised, and basically walking out of central casting for a YA paperback cover. They'd done modeling work before landing the roles, which makes sense because half the Sweet Valley aesthetic was essentially, what if high school was a catalog shoot? Brittany played Jessica, the impulsive, attention-loving spark plug. Cynthia played Elizabeth, thoughtful, studious, morally centered. And whether by instinct or direction, they leaned into those archetypes hard. The contrast was clean and immediate, which is exactly what the books had trained us to expect. And here's the thing, the show didn't try to reinvent the material, it translated it. The 90s syndication sweet spot. Sweet Valley High premiered in 1994 in first-run syndication, which if you didn't grow up in that era is hard to explain. It wasn't quite network TV royalty, but it wasn't cable obscurity either. It lived in that after-school zone, that liminal space between homework and dinner. You come home, drop your backpack, maybe microwave something you probably shouldn't have, and there it was. It ran for 4 seasons, 1994 through 1997, totaling 88 episodes. Ratings-wise, it was solid for its format. Not juggernaut status, but dependable. Syndicated teen programming thrived on consistency, not spectacle. It didn't need to dominate Thursday nights, it just needed you at 4 p.m. And for a while, it had us. The production leaned into glossy optimism, bright interiors, coordinated outfits, conflicts that escalated but never spiraled. Even when storylines touched on drinking, jealousy, or family tension, everything felt contained. The moral universe was stable. Adults were present but rarely oppressive. Consequences existed, but they were manageable. It was comfort television before we used that phrase. The high school we were promised. Sweet Valley High wasn't gritty. It wasn't ironic. It wasn't trying to deconstruct adolescence. Compared it to Beverly Hills 90210, which often leaned into heavier serialized drama, Sweet Valley was lighter, more episodic, more idealized. It felt less like this is what high school is and more like this is what high school should feel like. And if you were younger Gen X or an early Zennial watching, it quietly became a template. We internalized the lockers, the pet rallies, the idea that social problems could be solved in 22 minutes. We absorbed the aesthetic optimism, bright futures, manageable heartbreak, friendships that bounce back by the next episode. It aired in a cultural moment where teen media hadn't fully embraced edge. That shift was coming, darker storylines, more serialized angst, sharper dialogue. But Sweet Valley High belonged to the tail end of a softer era.
pre-Columbine, pre-9/11, pre the permanent low-hum anxiety that would settle into American life. That context matters because when the world changed, teen television changed with it. Life after Sweet Valley. When the show wrapped in 1997, it didn't implode, it just aged out of its moment. The late 90s were about to usher in a different tone. More self-awareness, more bite, more serialized complexity. The Daniels moved on. Brittany Daniel would later find a whole new audience on the game, proving she had ranged far beyond cheer captain energy. Cynthia eventually stepped away from acting, later pursuing photography and a more private life. But for those few years in the mid-90s, they were the Wakefields. And that matters because casting can make or break nostalgia. When we picture Sweet Valley High, we don't picture paperback illustrations anymore. We picture Brittany's smirk as Jessica, Cynthia's steady gaze as Elizabeth, the hair, the blazers, the earnestness. The show made the fantasy tangible. Why it couldn't last forever. There's something almost poetic about the fact that Sweet Valley High ended in 1997, right before teen media shifted into something sharper and more cynical. It wasn't built for the coming era of meta-commentary and postmodern wink-at-the-camera storytelling. It was built for a moment when high school drama could still feel insulated from global reality. And maybe that's why, looking back, it feels so preserved, like it exists under glass. Not perfect, not groundbreaking, but deeply specific to a cultural window that closed quietly and then permanently.
There was something sacred about the after-school block in the mid-90s. It wasn't prestige TV. It wasn't appointment viewing in the way prime time was marketed. It was ritual. You got home, you decompressed. You watched pretty people in sunlit hallways make extremely solvable problems feel enormous, and for 22 minutes at a time, the world felt small and safe. Sweet Valley High lived in that ecosystem, and it thrived there. It didn't need to dominate headlines. It needed to be dependable, familiar, like a favorite hoodie you never admit you still owned. And it wasn't alone. A few years later came Breaker High, which took the teen formula and put it on a cruise ship, because apparently in the 90s, even high school could be globalized and still feel adorable. That show followed a group of students doing a semester on sea, including a very pre-fame Ryan Gosling, who at the time was just that guy from the boat show to a lot of us. Together, shows like these created a curated adolescence, a cinematic brochure for what our teenage years were supposed to look like. And here's the quiet part we don't always say out loud. We believed them. The pre-9/11 glow. Sweet Valley High aired from 1994 to 1997, squarely in that pre-9/11 window where American pop culture still radiated a kind of unexamined optimism. Not that the 90s were perfect, they weren't, but the tone was different. The ambient anxiety wasn't constant yet. News didn't follow you in your pocket. Schools weren't framed through the lens of national tragedy. The biggest teen conflicts were cheating scandals, rivalries, bad dates. When we talk about Sweet Valley feeling like a time capsule, this is what we mean. It reflects a cultural mood that assumed stability, that assumed the world would keep humming along, that adolescence would be dramatic but safe. The future would be bright. The good times would stretch on longer than they probably should. Then reality got sharper. Columbine shifted the tone of teen media. The early 2000s introduced a more serialized, emotionally layered kind of storytelling. And after 9/11, optimism, especially the glossy, uncomplicated kind, felt naive. Sweet Valley High didn't predict any of that. It couldn't have. The template versus the truth. Looking back, Sweet Valley High wasn't just entertainment, it was branding for adolescence. It told us you will have a tight-knit friend group. Romance will be dramatic but survivable. Authority figures will be mildly inconvenient, not existential threats. Everything resets by next week. And when we actually got to high school, some of it matched, a lot of it didn't. Budgets were tighter, social hierarchies were messier, the world outside campus felt closer.
The stakes didn't always resolve neatly. But that's not a failure of the show. That's the nature of nostalgia. It doesn't promise accuracy, it promises feeling. Sweet Valley High made adolescence feel like a contained universe, a place where your identity could be explored without permanent damage, where you could be Jessica one week and Elizabeth the next and still be okay. Why it hits harder now. Watching it today isn't just about laughing at the fashion or clocking the melodrama. It's about recognizing how insulated it feels. There's no constant digital surveillance, no social media humiliation cycles, no omnipresent dread baked into the background. It's high school as a self-contained solar system. And for those of us who are young enough to absorb that vision before the cultural mode shifted, it carries a bittersweet edge. It reminds us not just of the show, but of who we were before the world got heavier. Sweet Valley High wasn't groundbreaking television, but it was a mood, a pre-millennial pause, a California-filtered promise, a brochure for a version of growing up that felt sunlit and manageable. And maybe the real nostalgia isn't for Sweet Valley itself, it's for believing that kind of optimism could last.
If you grew up racing home to catch this after school, let me know in the comments. Were you Team Jessica or Team Elizabeth? And did high school look anything like this for you? Subscribe if you're ready to rewatch the past with clearer eyes. This has been Nostalgic Couch Potato.